sehr geehrter Professor, sehr geehrte Professorinnen und alle liebe Kollegen und liebe Familie. Es freut mich sehr, dass Sie alle hier bei Ende und mit mir bleiben. Ich will jetzt, dass Sie verstehen, meine Vorträge auf Englisch halten. This also spares your ears from a lot of torture, and it definitely spares my throat a little bit as well. I had a terrible cough for about 1 week, and I was teaching 2 hours on Nanobiotechnologie this morning, so I hope that my voice will stay until the end of this talk, actually. So you got already an introduction to what nanoscience and nanobioscience is from Uwe, and since I'm his Nachfolger also, you don't expect that I'll be on time, but I will try to. Why is it that people doing nanoscience and nanobioscience so often start with definition? If I'm a little bit, I'd say brutal, I would say it's because there's a lot of money involved for the last 10 to 15 years by claiming that to do nanoscience, and people come from different disciplines and different backgrounds. Means that everybody is basically trying to bring in their definition in order to define the field and get a part of this money. But there's something very special about nano, of course, and I'm actually bringing out a slightly different definition that's sort of inspiring me compared to what Uwe did, and this is not because I'm obnoxious, it's because I like a good debate, and Uwe is a really good debater. For me, nano is not the specific size. It's not about being 100 nanometers or less. Actually, there are a lot of objects, if you are 100 nanometers big, they don't behave very special at all. They're just like your microscopic objects. However, for me, nano, if you put it in fuzzy terms or layman terms, it will be when something is so small that you actually cannot ignore how small it is. But it's still bigger than an atom or a single molecule, perhaps. This typically means that you're in an area where the area of the object becomes so dominant over the volume, so it takes over. So for example, we saw some plasmons before. This is when basically your electron density oscillation is going out to the surface of the object. One side of your nanoscale object sees the other. Nano, even more importantly for me, is sort of a way of thinking. We have different disciplines coming together. We will bring our sort of favorite way of looking at the world onto it, but we're dealing with about the same problems, which are on the same size scale, and want to do basically the same innovation and the same new knowledge creation. So where does bio come into this? Bio is of course a great source of inspiration for nanoscience. It wasn't from the beginning. It started sort of as a physics game by Feynman and so on that Jose already took a lot of quotes from. But it's been increasingly bio, and this is because biology, to a large extent, has its functional units and its building blocks on the nanoscale, and this is where they sort of work out and build. These building blocks has an immense complexity. They are very, very advanced compared to nanostructures that we can make. But if you're a physicist and a chemist, actually, they're quite restrictive as well. This is why I say that bio is an inspiration for us, because there are many physical phenomena and chemical tools on the nanoscale which nature does not use. So for me, it's nanobioscience is actually about taking the best of both these worlds. Inspiration for bio, often having the applications in bio, but applying my physics background to this. A lot of this talk will be about nanoparticles, and mainly the synthetic kind, and you already heard a lot about biological nanoparticles or so. But what are nanoparticles actually in a nanobioscience context? Well, you can then have different ways of looking at it, and these are a couple of them. So for example, nanoparticle could be like a protein, which is a very complex structure on the nanoscale. Very complex structure, very complex functionality. But it's sort of one unit. You could also have a virus, for example, which is actually an assembly of smaller objects on the nanoscale. This is another property we often deal with nanoparticles. Small objects putting themselves together on the nanoscale to create another nanoscale object. So also one thing you will hear a lot about today is about nanoparticles and liquids. Of course, a single particle cannot be a liquid. But there are a lot of, the nanoparticles so small that often they interact in a way that make them collectively behave as a liquid, or you can use liquids to sort of tailor the way that they go together. So you can also have sort of a liquid analogy for this. And there also, you will see antennas. They're a way that we can communicate with the nanoscale world, both putting energy in there and taking energy out of there. And then, of course, you have the famous Lego bricks, which you often use, for example, when you introduce nanotechnology especially. And you will not see so many Lego bricks today, but of course, it's another way of putting it together. You have particles, you can put them together into a certain structure. So, again, what has nano got to do with bio? Well, the biology has a lot of building blocks created already, which are very, very specific, and they can create wonderful, beautiful structures. But there's another thing in biology which I take as one of the take-home messages. This is that, for example, in biology, you have materials constantly creating and recreating themselves. They're rebuilding, they're destroying. It's basically a fluid system. Not always a fluid as you think about a liquid in the bulk. It can be a one-dimensional fluid or a two-dimensional fluid, like you see in this video from Harvard. And this sort of gives you morphing material and is changing according to the environment. This is how nature gets its trigger to reorganize. In a cell, the conditions change, light conditions change, so the pH changes, the structure will change. This is something that engineering materials don't do today. So physicists and engineers haven't really come to this point, although you see, for example, that NASA is dreaming about airplanes that are flying like birds, because a bird is changing the way wings look all the time. But a plane is not. But if it could, it would be a beautiful new way of making things, for example. Another thing is that this is also Uwe talked about a lot, is the biological building blocks on the nanoscale. They basically know where they belong and they can build the material together. Probably the two most advanced industries that we have are the car industry and the computer industry, and I would say in many ways the car industry, even though I hate cars, my father, are a horrible thing, but they're very, very advanced in the production. They're a very good analogy because you typically have platforms of how to build cars. A single door will fit into several different cars, for example. It's the way you put them together, you get different cars. But the thing is, you have to put them together. It has to be human, or for cars, typically a robot, placing every part, and then you bolt it down. You never want it to leave, because then your car will disassemble on the freeway. You don't like that. In nature, things put themselves together. You have a building block, it's created. It's then diffusing around, and it will build a structure from the bottom up. And they can be very, very complex structures nature is building. But they also sort of can disassemble afterwards, like we said. This is something that in a simpler way fascinated me already during my PhD. It's because I was assembling molecules in the surface, and every Christmas in Sweden we have to suffer this Disney cartoon of this little Zwergli, and he's creating his chessboard with a pencil. Basically painting the chessboard once. That's neat. That's the kind of research that I should do. But we were just putting the same molecule everywhere. So, but what I did, for example, during my first postdoc was that I would want to create these kind of chessboards. But in this case, it was for lipid membranes, like Eva was talking about. And the idea is, of course, that if we can create a chessboard and we can paint it, and especially repaint it, we can get, for example, membrane proteins for drug screening, place them at different points, then release them after we've done our measurement, and so on. It's a structure that can regenerate itself, and we know where things are, because the pieces know where they are. This is one example of this, which is basically a microchip with electrodes. There are 4 electrodes, and there's a background here where we self-assemble a polymer a couple of nanometers thick, which repels the assembled lipid molecules onto it. Down here, you already have assembled lipid membranes from the first parts of the experiments that we did. So this is a planar bilayer like you see in this cartoon here. But up here, you have polymers that are repelling any absorption of further liposomes. Now, if we apply a potential here, which is locally changing the pH, we can disassemble the polymer. It leaves the surface, so it becomes free. Here, we do not do that. Then we add liposomes in solution. They will stick to the surface and stick there. But if we change the surface potential by the local pH, by applying a potential here, we can make them disassemble from the liposomes into planar membrane. There were no membrane proteins here, so we're lying a little bit in the cartoon, but in principle, they could be. And now you see, I can do this sequentially, because also I can desorb a membrane, which I did here. Maybe it was a little bit quick, but there's no green color anymore, and then we start over. So in principle, we can go across these places, have different liposomes and different membrane proteins in different places. This is basically one version of a chessboard. And this was on a micron scale, and of course you can assemble proteins and liposomes and lipids also on the nanoscale. This is a nanoscale pattern. I don't have enough time to tell you how we did it, but it was nanoscale assembly from the first step to the last, basically. First having particles define the pattern, and then you have proteins that are fluorescent absorbing onto these spots. And why this look diffuse is because they are below the diffraction limit of the microscope, so you can't really resolve them. They look much better in reality. Here, Philip is one of my students still at ETH, but he's here working for 3 months at the moment, and he's doing a different thing. So he's also assembling lipid membranes onto pattern. And here we're after having patterns which are microstructured to interact with cells, absorbing, but the whole idea is that the assembly that we do on the pattern is now fluid. A lipid membrane, as heard, is a two-dimensional fluid, and this of course has relevance if you want to communicate with biological systems that are typically fluid. What we want to do in this project is, for example, to put neuronal cells which are defined by this pattern. This is a pattern to culture neuronal cells, and then we include guidance cues which are normally found in membranes of neurons when they're interacting and building up a neural network, and sort of look at the guidance of this, and especially look at how clustering of these cues changes the behavior, signaling, for example, of the neural cells. You can also take this to sort of a 3D level. This is a microwell, which my previous boss, Marcus Texas, became famous for, partly, where you sort of culture cells into a microenvironment that defines their size and their geometry. What we could do then is that by, again, doing molecular assembly, prohibiting, for example, a lipid membrane to form outside the well, we can create it only inside the well, as is shown here, and then build layer by layer protein structure that's interacting with the cell in guiding. What we could see from this was, for example, that while you normally culture cells in a Petri dish, they actually don't look very normal. They have a very strong skeleton sort of forming in, which is because they are stressed. They try to pull on the substrate, but they cannot move anything. In this case, they can restructure the material that they're interacting with and cluster the ligands as they would in a biological situation on the dimensions of a micro-sized cell environment, but on a nanoscale movement of molecules. And thus you sort of release this tension out of the cells, which might be a good way of culturing single cells in a nature-like environment. Going back even deeper down into the nanoscale, we can create, for example, nanoplasmonic structures. These are 100 nanometer big pyramids, which are hidden down into a pore, also about 100, 200 nanometers big. And on top of this, also by doing molecular assembly, where some molecules will only attach to the wall of the curved pore, some will only attach to the surface, and some will only attach to, for example, these plasmonic cones, we can assemble lipid membranes, we can assemble liposomes with proteins, and actually the most advanced versions, we even tag the liposomes. We give them all a barcode. They carry a DNA, single-stranded DNA, which has a certain code. It will only bind to another DNA that we can specifically put on this nanoplasmonic cone. Each one of these pyramids, which is 100 nanometers big, is basically a single sensor. And this is a picture where I put the liposomes. Now I've seen that Alain Bresson, he was here before, has left, I think, but one of the first demonstration we did here, he was here before, about the membrane protein positioned this way. We did with liposomes that he had harvested from some sort of electric eel or whatever. My wife thought it was really funny. I just thought it was another protein. And then we could put this onto the pillars and show that they were there. Now, moving on to the particles, which is sort of the core of what I do here, or focus on in the beginning. But I've done a lot of membranes and protein assembly before. The nanoparticles have a special fascination for me because now we have this antenna function I talked about before. And you can also have them working in 3 dimensions. Everything we saw before was bound to surface. Very practical if you want to measure things, but not always the most efficient way of, for example, studying molecules which are in a solution, and they are very few and hard to find, and so on. And of course, a 3D structure is much more advanced always than a 2D structure. Inorganic nanoparticles, this doesn't work very well, have very unique properties for imaging and actuation, as I usually say. This is what I call the antenna function. Oh, thank you very much. This is what I call the antenna function. So basically, a nanoparticle is very, very small. But because it's very small, it will interact very strongly with, for example, optical fields if it's a metal, or with magnetic fields, as it's our specialty to do magnetic nanoparticles if it's an oxide with a magnetic moment, like iron oxide. However, this quality of nanoparticles, it only exists as long as the particle exists separately. It's on the nanoscale. As soon as they start to bind together too closely and aggregate, they lose this property because they effectively become a macroscopic material again. It goes very quickly. With magnetic particles, like I said, 100 nanometers there is not reasonable scale. We're talking 20 nanometers, and it's too big to start becoming another type of magnetism, which is called ferromagnetic. So if you want to exploit these properties of nanoparticles, you have to create their interface, their interaction with other materials, and this is, of course, through shape and size, but especially through stable interfacial chemistry, which is sort of where I entered this field from the beginning. And if you can control interfacial chemistry, it means you can control the assembly, and it means you can control the interactions, and then you can go back to using these as nanoantennas, but now maybe you have tons of them. So you have a much stronger response. A single nanoparticle doesn't give a strong response. For magnetic particles, you have lots of applications. I'll just show them quickly. Common ones that are already used are magnetic resonance contrast agents. Magnetic camera in the clinic, for example, you want to take an image of an organ, you can do it. If you want to image disease in an early stage where it's just very, very small change to an organ, you cannot do it because the resolution is very bad. If you add nanoparticles, magnetic nanoparticles that target this, you will be able to pick up a much higher contrast thanks to the magnetic interaction with nanoparticles. You can also make them to be taken up by cells, specifically by targeting them, and then separate them out, of course, with a magnet. It's a very neat way of separating cells, which is coming more and more and more applications of. It's used in therapeutics, where the most brutal and the one that's most common, I think it went FDA approved last year, the first two magnetic nanoparticle hyperthermia applications, which is that you inject nanoparticles in a cancer tissue, they're not targeted yet, and then use external magnetic field, which heats your body from the outside, but it's heating on the inside, and you basically burn away the cancer in this way. You can also use them for drug delivery, and I won't tell about that now, because I will show you a beautiful example at the end of the video. Now, to control the structure and do all these things, we sort of start from the inside out. We start by defining a core. In this case, it's magnetite, Fe3O4, which is a supermagnetic material below the size of maybe, let's say, 12, 15 nanometers. We then go on and we try to define the interface with a shell that's surrounding it, which will now determine interaction with the rest of the surface of the world, and we can put functional groups, which is typically cartoonishly put here at the end of the shell. With these kind of building blocks called core shell nanoparticles, you can now assemble more advanced structures. Like, for example, you will see how to assemble them inside lipid membranes in order to actuate liposomes. Or you can place them at interfaces where they're dynamically rearranged and start playing tricks. But first, you have to start with the core shell nanoparticle. Here, Ronald, was my first postdoc here at the BOKU. I'm very happy to have him because he's a great chemist. He's the one who's synthesizing, or sort of basically taking our nanoparticles that we had already created to a new level. So these are new results, not published, where he's basically, I would say, makes the most beautiful iron oxide nanoparticles in the world, right? Unbelievably monodispersed. And the reason why I say it's so beautiful is because they're so monodispersed that I can do physics with it, which means that if I just have a too broad distribution, it's almost impossible to do physics, which means I cannot do crystallization, I cannot really do carbon calculations on what structures I will get. But these are just as nice as you would have it. But here they are bare. You have to coat them with something, and this is something we did at the ETH before. You need an anchor group then to bind your shell to the surface, assemble it and make it stay there, because if it leaves, your particle becomes unstable. What we did here was being binding-inspired. So it's very difficult to find good binding chemistry for oxides. There's not much around. Thiol and gold is known and so on. We needed something that was much better than thiol and gold, but binding to Fe3O4 instead. Luckily, nature is full of organisms that are fixating iron to a large extent. A lot of them are also bacteria, actually. And the nicest lesson here, to make a very long story, 2 years short, is that actually you should not be as good as nature. Because what we did first was we were taking out molecular motifs from this catechol-like family that were the best ones that people had known for fixing iron atoms in bacteria. However, we lost 6 months from that because what happened was that we were ripping out iron atoms from our nanoparticles. They were eaten and just taken away, which was very difficult to know because we cannot really see these nanoparticles, especially not if they disappear. Instead, we had to settle for what every engineer would have known, but typically not physicists, which is that you should optimize, you should not maximize. And the optimization in this case was to use another, little bit weaker binding nitrocaptacle family, which is a molecular group that binds very strongly to metal and semi-metal ions in oxides. And this one binds extremely strongly to iron and iron oxide. And by this, we could start defining shells. The nice thing of having the perfect binding group, as we almost have, is that we can now more or less define the density of what we put on the surface by the anchor group itself. And then we just can create the shell, changing the molecular weight, changing the chemical properties, and so on, and just add anything that we want on. And this also Donald has developed further. And then look at the colloidal stability and look at the biological response of these things. So the anchor is the key to creating a good shell, sort of our lesson from working with these nanoparticles. And what is the difference? Well, this is a quite typically stabilized, which I would call unstabilized. This is why I wrote it here, but it's actually badly stabilized nanoparticles put onto a normal magnet. And they just precipitate out of this magnetic field and cluster at the end. These are ones that are stabilized with a shell now, which is, when you try to compress it, it goes to a very high energy state. It's basically osmotic force and try to push the other particles apart, and now they are suspended in solution. And this is something typically, if you want to work on the nanoscale, is that you're in a regime where thermal motion, or the thermal energy of the system, is big enough to compete with any other force that you're putting on here. So this is gravitation, which of course is a huge force, but mainly applicable to large objects. But it goes for magnetic interactions, for optical interactions, and electrical interactions and so as well. So the colloidal science of the nanoscale is extremely interesting because you have a competition of so many forces, and you can use heat to randomize your system, which is what we're doing here. Now, this was stability in the test tube. Does it translate? I don't have time to show a lot of data, but yeah, it translates also, for example, to biological response. So this is something that we have big plans to continue on, but at the moment it's poor Andrea who has to do almost all the work here of looking at cell uptake on nanoparticles, because we basically think that the best stealth particles that we have are so invisible to cells that are probably the first ones who are really invisible. We don't even see uptake in a macrophage from these particles. If you take the currently best things that are sold on the market, this is what people believe is normal, that if you have a stealth particle, they still get taken up by macrophages. I would say the truth is that they're not. It's just because these are not stable enough. They have to de-aggregate in a biological environment. Either they're aggregated by the cells, the macrophages in this case, or by the biofluid itself, which is a very demanding environment if your shell is not tightly bound. Because every time a molecule leaves your surface, another one can go in, and you're not invisible anymore. It's like basically drilling a hole in one of the American stealth planes, which I would like to do sometime. Now, there's invisible. Maybe you want to make them visible again. Visible means two things. One is to use them as this reporter of what is in the biological system, for example. But first, you have to find what you want to do. These are the functional groups. Now, the way we do it is that we actually assemble these dispersants on the particle from the beginning, so it means that we can sort of tune how many functional groups you have here. This is kind of important because this is a nanoscale object, so it has a very high curvature, and the binding affinities of these systems are not as simple as it is for single molecules or for macroscopic events. It's somewhere in between. And luckily, we don't have to kill a lot of mice to do this because we have our membrane models on biosensors, and we can look at binding kinetics and interactions with model cell membranes instead. And of course, we do cell targeting, and yeah, we have killed a few mice, and it sort of looked like that worked too. Putting these things together now, actually, from a physicist point of view, a membrane is sort of the interface between oil and water, but it's water, oil, water. So if I want to simplify this in absurdum, as a physicist, I just take oil and water and nothing in between, and I look at how my nanoparticles behave at these interfaces. And this leads to a lot of interesting physics, but as Jose already explained, it has a lot of applications in colloidal science, which ranges from making perfect concrete to make high skyscrapers to making the perfect chocolate. Switzerland, the biggest sponsor of this kind of research, is Nestle. If you put something like a nanoparticle at the interface between two liquids that are not mixing, the energy of trapping is unbelievably high. This is a calculation for a 10 nanometer particle. It's smaller than a virus, and it will stick with an energy of 1000 kT. So around 510 kT, things will start to go off an interface, because this is the energy unit of sort of the thermal heat in your system. So 1000 kT something is unbelievably stuck at the interface. And the reason is because you take a bit of the surface area between these two fluids that don't like each other away. The nice thing is that it's stuck, like you have glued it to a surface, but the surface is not a solid, it's a liquid. You can have the particles move around here on a trajectory, and by defining the nanoparticle properties, you can sort of define what interactions are tuning their mobility, how they will assemble together. So this is something that was interesting to us to look at the nanoscale. It's been done a lot on the microscale. It's a 100-year-old field. But not so many people have done it on the nanoscale, or actually almost none. So we wanted to develop new methods to do it. This is if you take 100 nanometer big particles, you can take smaller as well. And this is an interface between the water and the oil, and we broke it up. And then the particles are arranging here in a very nice spacing defined by the charge that they have. If the particles now are, this was a frozen interface, and this is a method we stole from Uwe and co-workers that have been working on this forever, but we physicists haven't really used it very much, and sort of was forgotten at ETH, for example. But if we now assemble the particles at the interface, and then we rupture it and break away the oil, and we have the amorphous water left, we can just evaporate the metal film onto the particles at an angle, and by this, it's just normal trigonometry to calculate the contact angle of the particle. Basically, the height at which the particle sits at the interface, and this height is what determines the energy of the system. So by this, we sort of have a tool to measure the surface energy of nanoparticles, and we do it down so far to about 10 nanometers, which is the size of a protein and smaller than a virus. So for us, it's a very neat tool to determine the property that will say the most on how we assemble nanoparticles. It's actually, we can do it on so small particles that we can measure not only what the area reduction does. If you go really, really nano, also the one-dimensional energies start to matter. So there's a line energy contribution from the particle meeting both solids at a single time, and we can even measure how big this contribution is to nanoparticles that are very small, like 10 to 5 nanometers. If you take the coarser nanoparticles now, which has a very, very complex structure, and put them at an interface, we try to create new materials. So we have a toolkit where we can tune the core size, and we can tune the polymer sizes, which is the shell size, and basically mix and match everything together. We can put functional groups, and now we can assemble them at the interface. The question is, do they also stay there? What kind of energy do they have? What kind of structure can we form? But this is basically, if they close pack here, as they should, because there are no long-range interactions, they are the size of proteins again, so any pores will be about the same size as you saw in the S-layer protein. But we have an additional advantage if you manage to do this, which is that we have an antenna here, a magnetic antenna. We can induce energy, and we can make conformational changes in the system, for example, aggregate them, which reversibly create bigger pores and so on, or move the whole system. And right now, for example, making this also onto nano emulsions, so 100 nanometer big oil droplets for drug delivery and so on. Ernest in the office is doing this. There's a lot of science going into this, looking at how they absorb from oil into water interface, and actually we already solved more or less what the energy contribution should be. And it turns out that a very interesting aspect of this, which is relevant also for biological molecules probably that are more complex, is that this polymeric shell around basically determines the energy of particles at the interface, not only the hard core. So back to the more or less the final example, but it'll take a little bit of time. Is it back to the membranes again? Lipid membranes are two-dimensional fluids, and the old model was a bit more boringly drawn like this. It looks very static actually, with proteins floating around here, but they look stuck. But in reality, everything is moving all the time in rafts, so single proteins are. But membrane proteins, they have sort of the limitations. They, for example, typically don't have this antenna function I was talking about. But our nanoparticles are the same size. Maybe we can make a simpler membrane system exchange. Instead of having proteins, we have nanoparticles, and we can start controlling what the membrane does. And suddenly we have a real hybrid between a nano-scale physical system and a nano-scale biological system. Where can this be applied? You have to find an application first to get some money, and one of them is drug delivery, of course. So a typical problem is that you want to deliver drugs using a liposome, which is a very nice vehicle. It's about 100 nanometers big. We can store a lot of drugs inside here, which are hydrophilic or hydrophobic drugs inside the membrane, and you can make it stealth by adding polymers and so on, and then you want to release it. Thing is, you have to make this very, very stealth, invisible to the body in order to make it go through the bloodstream and find its target. However, in you doing so, you make it stable. It will not release the drugs efficiently if you do so. If you make it unstable, for example, try to use a temperature or pH difference. Typically, the temperature or pH of a cancer, let's say, is a little bit different, which means that you can try to make a phase transition in the lipid membrane that releases the drug at this change of temperature or pH. However, the differences are not very big, which means that then most of the time you will leak molecules all the time when transporting, and you lose these nice properties. However, let's consider something like this. If you make a membrane now which has a very high melting transition, which is the point where the membrane will start to leak drugs out, but which is much higher, let's say 55 degrees, and your body is at 37, and now you put nanoparticles in, you could apply a magnetic field, and then you make the particles move out of phase with the magnetic field. You will produce heat locally, and the drugs will come out because you heat the membrane to 55 degrees, but you do not heat the rest of the body. So luckily, if it works, the tissue should be unharmed, and the drug should be released. So this requires some things. Again, a long story, somewhat short at least, is that if you can assemble the particles inside the membrane and they do not aggregate your hole, then it works. And these are basically liposomes and ruptured planar membranes with nanoparticles in them that show that we have this liquid-like assembly. The particles are organizing like they were in a liquid as we want, and this is due to a very special, very thin, but very stable hydrophobic coating. And now we can try to go to the functionality of the system. And it works. What these graphs shows is that we can pulse the release of the drug. Basically, we pulse for a couple of minutes, and then we stop the system. So we can release, stop, release, stop, release, stop, until we emptied all the drugs out of the system. If you would have, and at the same time, we're not heating the sample very much. Actually, most of this heating comes from the beaker and not from the particle. So we're really just changing the temperature of the membrane itself in order to release. If you make this with particles that are not stable, it doesn't work. So a quick teaser of what we're doing now, which is completely new to me at the BOKU. I haven't done it before, is that, okay, we had this heating transition of the membranes to do leaking, but we can do smarter things, we think. For example, we know that if the particles become big enough, they will destroy and disrupt the membrane. Maybe locally, mechanically stabilize it, and most of the time we get this kind of mycelation, the particles go out. This you do if you do an uncontrolled, unstable particle, but actually we have a particle, we can switch the stability. Because in a strong magnetic field for a fixed vesicle, for example, you can create a magnetic moment to the nanoparticles that are nicely embedded inside the membrane, which will make them cluster together. Now they have a strong force to go together. They didn't have it before, and probably can do rupture. So we want to look at that different release mechanisms, which are not dependent on this melting transition. And this is probably the most promising one of those. If you have particles inside a cell, this is what I call this Trojan horse strategy. What happens if you apply this to a cell system? Actually, we know already, I'll show you the data, and we know already from literature before, from quantum dots, that particles will end up somehow in the membrane, just taking a normal liposome, exposing it to cells. Somehow they fuse, probably the cell tries to take up and destroy, but the particles get stuck here. This is now done uncontrolled, but if we can target them to certain receptors, maybe we can even localize the domain in the cell where we get these things to insert. And then, of course, applying magnetic fields, we can do different things, like changing the permeability through heating, or destroying proteins, or even moving things around. Because, of course, a particle like this can have a linker as well, which is touching other things and moving it around. So basically, we want to look at how we can go from working completely artificial systems to basically program backdoors also into cells to inject material into them or change the local functional proteins and so on. The other new, to me, cool and new area is what we call colloidal science 2.0. 2.0 is an analogy with basically Web 2.0, which is more interactive and more custom-made to your personal experience. The idea here is that we know from, to make three-dimensional structures in nature, it's often starting from a 1D object, like a protein. It has a sequence. It folds into a three-dimensional structure which is specific. Ivan Kaluza, who's a theoretician here at the Uni Wien, he came up with a very nice model that Peter found, which was that he could basically reduce the problem of proton folding from a physical point of view to having colloids on a string with quite defined but simple interaction potentials, and they will always find a way to fold specifically. However, again, to me actually nature is boring. Proteins only have more or less two structures, alpha helices and beta sheets. There's not so much else, but the kind of structures you can get is more or less infinite. And by changing the kind of colloids, the kind of interactions, not only having what amino acids have, you can get other structures. This is maybe the most simple one, but the one we're targeting first. And here you see some colloidal strings that Peter has already made and sort of playing with electric fields. How we're making another part of the colloid science 2.0 thing is that we try to build everything by bottom-up approach. So if we can encode mechanical and other structural properties on small nanoparticles, we can assemble them layer by layer. Just like you assemble polymers layer by layer and define a big structure which has a very high molecular weight, not possible to reach with normal polymerization in normal chemistry. But in this way we think we can do it and also create asymmetric interactions between particles, which makes it possible to fold really, really interesting 3D structures. Now we're sort of on the big nanometer scale or sub-micron scale, but we want to in the end go down to nanoscale again. With this, I overstayed my welcome, but I want to do some thanks as well. I want to thank my family, my father and my mother, who probably at least now think I have a real job. I think my grandmother also think I have a real job because now I work at the Institut für Bodenkultur in Wien, working at the Technische Hochschule in Zurich was now really something. Really. But we have a previous academic in the family, the only one, and he works at the Lantbruksuniversitetet in Uppsala. My family I want to thank a lot. When it's proposal writing or writing time, they say I love my computer more than I love them. It's really not true, but you see the love is going genetically. These are my mentors, Ben Casamo, probably surprised I got my PhD. Fredrik, Wolfgang, and Marcus. Marcus taught me really a lot about the biointerfaces and sort of introduced me to chemistry in this case. You didn't see what most of these people did that I worked with, so you just had to trust me that they were all great, and I learned a lot from working with them. We basically only saw some work from Philip and Lucio and Matteo here. And Lucio and Philip are still with me. And it's my new BOKU family, Ronald, Peter, and Andrea, and of course I'm extremely happy to have my new two colleagues, Jose and Eva, who started together with me, and Uwe as a mentor and sort of role model in this. And I want to thank everybody else I worked with. Final comment on nanoscience is that typically we try to make it look cool. I think I was a bit guilty of that today as well. It looks then more or less to magic, I realize, to students and to the public. And actually I think this is a problem for us. This is why people are starting to get scared now instead of throwing money at us. So the thing is, it's not magic, it's just normal nature, and we're trying to take tools from biology and nature and use them in a new way on a new scale. So one of the prizes I have is together with Mark, who's a friend from Switzerland, and Stefan, who's an artist. I'm doing huge robotic sculptures from Germany, but he likes to do nano art, he says, instead. And Bengt, who's a really super intelligent hardware hacker. We have this little project we call Nano Schmano, so we meet at the moment once per year, and we have about 1 week of art workshop, which is public. That people come in. This was from this year in Ljubljana. We sort of had on the main street just doing experiments and doing art, but from things that would illustrate nano things. It was really, really fun. Because you have people, you have real interaction, and you get to know what is magic, what is not for them, and you try to bring out the magic. And this is our challenge, I think, to use the magic which is in biology, but it's not magic because it's around us all the time, and be inspired of it in order to re-engineer things that are more robust and more suited to our applications. And with that, I would like to stop my lecture, and I got told to put on this beautiful picture, which I wish was me, but so.